Okay, so we'll give everybody about a minute. Kick off. Okay, another few seconds and then we'll kick off. Thank you, Alex, for sharing the slide. Okay, firstly, welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion on site reliability engineering and specifically making SRE work for real-world reliability, people and teams. I'm Colin Houlihan, the VP of Consulting for NearForm. Just some housekeeping really before we kick off. The format for today, really we'll have maybe 40-45 minutes discussion with Niall and Luca, who will introduce shortly. There will be time then in the last 5, 10, 15 minutes for questions. So please submit your questions as we go through the session today, and we'll try and get to those at the end. I'm conscious that we've quite a broad audience today, so we're trying to create content, questions, discussion that will hit all of those in the audience. So if we start with the basics and what people already know, then please stay with us as we'll go deeper and deeper into SRE. So I'm delighted to have today two experts in the space for today's talk. Firstly, our guest speaker is Niall Murphy. Niall's an award-winning author, speaker, technologist, and executive leader. He's known for his co-author of the best-selling and an industry-defining, really, site reliability engineering book, as well as the follow-on to that, which was the Site Reliability Work book. And Niall's devoted over 20 years to mission-critical engineering roles in large-scale service operations. And I know, Niall, you're working on some exciting projects at the moment, and maybe we'll touch on those later on. So a big thank you for your time, taking time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Can I also say I rock t-shirts? I mean, that t-shirt is just the best ever.
It is very impressive. We got a lot of comments on that in the run-up to the event. I think some people just turned up really to see you in that t-shirt. So for those, unfortunately,
disappointment.
Yeah. And then alongside Niall, we have NearForm's Luca Lanziani. Luca is a technical director, leader in DevOps and SRE in NearForm. As he says, he was born a software engineer and a real passion for infrastructure and the process around DevOps and SRE. Luca, I'm going to ask you first to introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. Let me start saying that I don't rock t-shirts, but I like facial hairs. As you can see, right? That's my specialty. And people that know me will know that I usually change my look every now and then. So yeah, as you say, I started as a software engineer. It was always my passion. I started coding when at a young age. I had to fight my father to get a computer back then, right? It wasn't that normal to get a computer. It was quite costly. But from there, my passion grew and grew. I started studying software engineer. And when I started my professional career, I discovered that while the software part had most of the problems solved, at least at the time, the infrastructure part was lacking a lot of the automation, a lot of the tools that the software had. And that's when I started getting passionate about infrastructure, processes, and so on. From there, I grew into this new wave of infrastructure, DevOps, SRE, and so on. And then in the past, I think 5 to 6 years, I moved into management, and I don't lose any occasion to talk about SRE, DevOps, and infrastructure wherever I can. that's my obsession right now, I can say.
And what was that first computer that you bought?
Oh, that was so. So I had I had a Commodore 64, but then the first one that I really thought my father to get, it was a Pentium 133, if I remember, the one that had the turbo button. That was amazing, right? You could push that and you can feel the computer speed up. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that as well, actually. Niall, can you tell us a bit about your journey and you know how you ended up in the wonderful world of SRE?
Yeah, so if we're going to go back to first computer, this might take a long time, is the only thing I'd say. But leaving aside Amstrad CPC 464s in the 80s, I think you'd say that my formal journey with SRE begins in about 2006 or thereabouts, when I joined Google for the first time. And I spent 11 years in that institution, during which I write the SRE book. And actually, for trivia reasons, I don't actually interview as an SRE. I come in the door as a sysop or something like that. But within 3 months, I changed manager, desk twice, and function twice, which gives you a feeling for how stable early Google was. It wasn't that early, but like mid Google probably. I suppose prior to that, I had actually spent a very, I suppose the term I'm looking for is mixed, or I'd had a kind of a Catholic career, in the sense of a lot of different bits. I've been a network engineer, I've been a software engineer, I've been a systems engineer, I've been a system administrator, kind of done a bit of everything. And even in my Google career, I've gone between IC and manager kind of 3 times, something like that. So in some sense, one of the attributes of SRE, which is holistic thinking, systems thinking, turns out to be a lot easier if you have a disparate background and you're not accustomed to fixating on one particular way of approaching things.
Yeah, makes sense. And you know, I suppose before we go too much further, I think the term, perhaps it gets thrown around a lot in the industry, perhaps maybe a bit misunderstood. When people ask you what is SRE, what do you say?
Well, you can have the short answer or you can have the long answer. Or
I'll go for the long one now. If 50 minutes,
fair enough.
Loads of time.
Fair enough. Got to get your money's worth. So I suppose the long answer is that most of the traditional way of doing, I suppose, software delivery and running of systems and so on and so forth falls into this development and operations hard split. People who write code over here, people who do not write code over here. And that turns out to be terrible for a variety of reasons. Now, the definition of terrible could vary. And actually, in some cases, terrible can mean, oh, the business can run this kind of cheaply, which is actually one of the other reasons why this split tends to happen, as opposed to kind of skills or competency. But basically, operations is terrible. No one really has a handle on how to do it kind of reproducibly well all of the time. And SRE is a response to that fact. It's a different way of organizing how you do software delivery and running of systems and software authoring as well. To I suppose originating in the Google context, it's kind of mostly deployed to either large or important systems. We see both of those in the industry generally, but it could be done to anything, because really what it is a body of knowledge about how to do things well. And that body of knowledge is prescriptive generally. It's not a vague philosophy. I mean, people talk a lot about the relationship between DevOps and SRE, talk a lot about DevOps generally. DevOps, in my mind, is also a reaction to the fact that development operations hard splits are terrible and have finger pointing and all kinds of bad organizational attributes and bad kind of experiences for the people inside those organizations. But broadly speaking, I would say SRE is a body of knowledge about how to do things with respect to services well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you touch on, and probably I'm paraphrasing a bit, but I think maybe a behavioral shift or maybe a mindset shift, thinking about the systems. I think you use the word caring often, caring about the system performance and reliability. I mean, look at, how does that tend to manifest itself, or how do you see that when a company or a team goes in this direction? How do you see that change in behavior or that mindset?
I'm actually going to use one of the phrases that Neil said in one of his previous interview when was asked, I think it was something along the line, when a company should hire the first SRE, right? And and Neil, correctly, I said that probably you already have someone that is playing the SRE role in your company, right? And that person is the person that is already taking care of your system in production. I love how in the book they say that, like for the chill bird, right? The 40 to 90% of effort is after the chill bird, right? And still, as developers, we only take care of the first part when we write the software. We don't really think about the long living of the software, right? So usually in your company, there's already someone that is doing that job. There's already someone that is taking care of the next part, right? What happened after I push the code? What happened after the code reaches production? And so we see that a lot. We see that a lot, and we see that there are people passionate in the company doing that, but it's not formalized. No one is telling you, yes, that's your role, right? That's your responsibility. And that's one of the main problems that we see. Processes may be there, but again, they are not formal, they are not recognized, and they're just coming out of the initiatives of few people that care about doing that. So that's what we usually see. Now, we usually see, I'm not saying that everyone is like that, but that's usually what people have before formalizing the SRE role.
It makes sense, I suppose, and I've seen that myself in some of my past lives. I suppose if we take that assumption, then that in many teams there is maybe someone doing the role already, maybe not formally, as we start to then formalize it, and this one maybe for you, Niall, how does that then change in the organization? And again, both I think at the team level, but more also at the leadership, leadership level of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, there's a large number of possible configurations of this kind of stuff. I find it a bit clearer to, as Luca says, think about the behaviors rather than like job titles or stuff like that. I know you've asked an organizational question, and we'll get to that. But I suppose at the very smallest micro dose of SRE, you have people who are behaving kind of in SRE style ways, which is to say to care about production, to try and formalize responses and think about ways that things could be made better. And in essence, not treating it as a cost center, which is to say, oh, actually, maybe looking after your stuff has some value, right? And that turns out to be a huge step for some people to make. But anyway, the click up from that, I suppose we would say is, okay, you had a bunch of people, or maybe people behaving in this way. Now they get together in some informal way. So there's some kind of loose coalition of people who care about this, maybe across teams or across services or something like that. Then the click up from that is probably formalizing that arrangement. And there's an explicit team to do that. Now, there's a couple of different arrangements for teams to do kind of SRE work. And as I say, you can be totally fine with informal arrangements within various limits. There's a couple of formal arrangements. There's the what I will call the Google model of, we are 6 to 12 people and we are bound to a long-running service or piece of infrastructure, and we look after that in combination with the development team, and it's a partnership model. That's cool. We can also have a distributed model. Facebook does this in what they call production engineering. It's also kind of sort of a consultancy model. There's a specific, we'll say, product team that needs advice on how to make something a bit more resilient or cloudy or whatever, but basically they're missing some expertise in the infrastructure space or infrastructure concerns generally. And so you post an SRE to go and sit with them for like 6 months or something like that. And often that's project oriented. Gosh, we really need to ship this before the end of the year, so let's put some expertise in there. They're not bound to a long-running piece of infrastructure. They don't maybe communicate formally with other SREs every day, like maybe there's a weekly coordination or something. I mean, I don't know, but lots of a distributed dust of systems expertise in a way, and also software expertise, of course. And then the configuration after that, or another configuration, is what I'll call an end-to-end team, which is usually associated with, the clearest story I can tell is there's some metric you care about. Some customer experience metric will say it's, for the sake of argument, time to create an account or something like that. And it turns out that time to create an account is composed of the actions of 11 separate siloized teams who are doing their own thing and optimizing their own metrics, but actually the time metric is across all of those and none of them are individually responsible for it. So you can also have an end-to-end team that cares about a metric which has to be integrated horizontally across a company. So those are arrangements I'm familiar with.
And in I suppose in every scenario, you're caring, if we take the example of maybe a transactional system, something that's user facing, consumer facing, you're caring about that journey, that uptime, that reliability, that experience for them, right?
Of course.
And how does that then manifest itself in terms of two things? One, in terms of the work that needs to get done, but secondly, maybe in terms of that business case, or that and the selling that need into the organization. Because in my experience, some of that reliability, that performance, those, maybe we would have called them non-functional requirements before, they're often deprioritized as we prioritize functional requirements in our products.
Yeah, that turns out to be a huge question for a bunch of reasons. I think I will start out by observing that most folks understand intuitively that quality of some kind matters, that what is produced by the headlong rush to deliver features is, one popular phrase is technical debt. I have some difficulties with that phrase, but let's use it for the moment. There is at least an intuitive recognition that you can do a headlong rush for a while, but actually got to clean up after yourself. And maybe the cleaning up is everyone gets together at the end of the quarter and tidies the kitchen, or maybe it's better done by washing your dishes every night, or there's some kind of rhythm to that. But there's a recognition, I think, that actually you can't just sit there and deliver features all of the time and not have something go bad. Also, it turns out that there's some pretty good research suggesting that we're not all that good as a species at delivering features, or more accurately, at figuring out what worth those features have. So there's a paper from a bunch of folks in Microsoft that I find pretty suggestive in this domain. And it says basically, look, if you have a bunch of features in your backlog and you're thinking about implementing them, etc., about 1/3 of features on average do more or less what you expected them to do in terms of, I suppose, revenue delivery or functional accomplishments, whatever. Maybe you even every so often have a 10x style success where you didn't expect it, and so on and so forth. Okay, fine. 1/3 of features are revenue neutral. You expend time to do them, and you don't get anything back, or you get back about what it cost you to put those features in and their ongoing maintenance cost, which is a huge piece that people ignore a lot of the time, right? And 1/3 of features are negative. So they actually lose you money or don't accomplish in a negative way what you were hoping to accomplish with them. So if that is in fact true, then I come along to you with a piece of reliability work, which hopefully there's some measurement that I can justify it, etc. But I can say that on average, 2/3 of the stuff that you are doing is going to be neutral or negative. And this at least will correct something that we know is negative. So on average, it's better to do our piece of work. Now, that's a bit more of a confrontational style than I think would be useful in many organizations. But it is, I think, a reflection of the reality that our model, that revenue generation is the most important thing, and all of the resources go into that, and everything else is deprioritized and useless and so on. That turns out not to be true. Of course, it can be difficult to have that numerical argument because a lot of those conversations are very short term, and a lot of the recognition or the fundamental underlying philosophy of SRE is that stuff it's about life cycles, it's about long-term effort, it's about actually tidying up the kitchen every night before you go to bed, because that turns out to save you time in the long run.
Yeah, look, I can see you're furiously nodding there in terms of that point around building this into the SDLC, right? And that it isn't a piece on the side, or it isn't a, do it once and then forget about it. Tell me a bit more about, how we do that now, and how do we maybe change how we think of system development in that perspective?
Well, I love everything that Neil said, but I agree on the fact that especially on the last part, right, that is always a loop, right? The infrastructure is always there, the processes are always there. And I struggled multiple times in the past to explain that once you build the infrastructure, you are not done, right? And that is something that is difficult to sell already. People think that, okay, we need an infrastructure, just build it for us, it's going to be there and it's going to stay there. Nothing is static right now. Nothing is static, right? You're going to still push features. You're going to still push changes, and that is going to change the state of the system, and it is going to make the system feel in different ways. So including all those processes, right? And when we talk about SRE, we're talking about availability, latency, performances, monitoring, change management, all this kind of stuff into the process, and keep working on those and keep improving on those is something that you want to keep doing day by day. That's why it's important to have those kind of figures in your organization. One thing, going back to the question that you asked, right, about how to, if you want, how to present this to the business, how to give the business the reason to adopt those things. One thing that I've seen in the past is that business is very responding to numbers, right? You need to present the right numbers. They really, they really love KPIs, they really write hard numbers to work on. And one thing that in the past we have done is to use the mean time to repair as a metric, right? So how long does it take you when something goes down, something fails, to recover from that failure? And that is something that hurts, right? It's very clear to a business person when latency is not clear, right? People can be okay. If it takes 3 seconds for them, 3 seconds is not a big number, right? We know as developers that we want to go below, we want to go on the milliseconds, right? But when system goes down, that is clear to everyone, right? That is when you're starting to lose money. And if you use that number, for instance, there are others, right? That is a very clear signal to the business that you want to reduce the time the system is down. If you can present a use case, a business case for that, adopting certain functions, adopting certain principles, adopting certain tools, we can reduce that number. That is going to hit right there where it hurts, right? It's going to send the right message right away. And what we've done in the past is that we take a small part of the system, we work on that small part of the system, and we reduce the mean time to repair for that small part of the system. That is the use case. You present the case in a small part, and you then say, okay, if we can apply the same thing to the overall system, imagine what is going to happen, right? That's one way to enter or to open the door, let's say.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I know that there's a body of research, and I suppose it's quite old at this point, that can correlate those metrics that you referred to and increase financial and organizational success, right? We've talked a lot maybe about the SRE at maybe at high level. Now to drill a bit deeper, Niall, I know the SRE comes with its own language, right? And it introduces us to these new phrases or these new terms, SLOs, SLAs, SLIs. Can you talk a bit more about how those fit into the equation?
Yes. So, I mean, this is a huge area. People have started entire companies to deal with this. So I don't know that we're going to get the definitive treatment in the next 7.3 minutes or whatever it is, 1.3 minutes. But I'll say the following things, that if you don't know what an SLO is, it's kind of like, and you have a business background, it's kind of like a KPI for systems, which is to say it's some target. The big revolution, I suppose, in this space is trying to get organizational agreement that the user should have a particular experience and that experience should be well defined, and that well-defined experience relates to the business in some useful way. Most of the time, people pick a user experience which is measured in nines, some fractions of 100%, like 2 nines, 99% available or up, or however you would define it. There's actually a huge amount of variation in the space. But broadly speaking, SLIs are indicators, they're metrics, latency, etc. SLOs are objectives, they're targets. We want 99% of all requests to terminate within 250 milliseconds. And SLAs are the legal agreement that, in theory, if you violate your SLO to your users, the users are entitled to some compensation for this violated expectation. But actually, in my opinion, even though there's a certain amount of innovation, for want of a better word, in how these things are measured and aggregated and so on and so forth, the primary innovation is organizationally getting the business and engineering down together and saying, like, decide what do you want? Like, decide what you want and agree it, and then we'll do that. And specifically agree that the number should not be 100%, because most folks who aren't, I suppose, in touch with the details of how these systems are managed go, of course, we just want it up all the time. Like, why would we pick any number other than 100? And it turns out that picking the number 100 will fail and is really expensive.
And tell me, what does that process then look like? So you take, again, if you look at maybe a transactional web platform selling widgets, something like that, you know, how does that process work then to define what those numbers are? How do we know where our boundaries are? What's going to be too much? What's going to be too little?
There's a huge, well, as I say, there's a huge body of work around this, with an unfortunately small amount of work having been done on objective, extremely solid places to stand in order to construct these. So there's a lot of what I'll call cargo culting or copy and pasting or whatever. But there's two things we could use to guide this process. The first one is that there is actually a fair amount of studies showing, this is particularly clear for latency, by the way, but it also applies in other things. There's a certain number of studies showing that as the behavior of your system becomes more unusable, your customer use kind of drops off. But actually, it's way subtler than, okay, now we're entirely down. Now no customers can use it. Okay, that's bad. I think we can all agree that's bad. But actually, there's a kind of a curve, and that curve, which I think, as I say, is most well defined in the case of latency, but it exists in other things as well, suggests that for every, we'll say, 50 ms of additional latency, you lose 1% to your customers, like scaling up exponentially, basically. So, Luca, you were talking earlier about 3 seconds. Like 3 seconds is just a terrible number in kind of real-time response systems. That would be lots of customer loss. So putting it bluntly, there's some kind of extremes that you want to stay away from. we've already talked about the 100% perfectly available, zero latency, unachievable. And we have some suggestions and some studies about the other extreme where they're very high latency. Okay, we're in the middle somewhere. Now, what do you use to define the things that you should care about? Well, most people, maybe that's wrong. A useful way to proceed is to think about the user journeys that are in your application. And for most things, you have some kind of sign-in flow, you might have a purchase flow, you might have a change password flow, like all of those kinds of things that users actually want to do with your system. You go, okay, those are the things we care about. Like if the users can't log in, that's a huge issue, even if we're responding perfectly with 100 ms latency, you know, or whatever, for every request. If they can't log in, that's a huge problem. So you look at the user journeys and you do the difficult and not necessarily hugely anticipatable in advance work of deciding what metrics go together to support that user journey. And of course, that's all externally facing, right? We're talking about the user experience, and we've been talking about SLOs mostly in that context, but also systems which are relatively closed in and of themselves, or maybe have internal APIs, etc. Those also might have SLOs to dependent systems inside your organization as well. And there's an art and a science that goes towards, first of all, deciding what those SLOs should be. Again, supporting the user journeys is probably the clearest way you can think about this, but also compensating if those SLOs aren't met. Okay, for example, in the machine learning case, if I have a recommender system and it doesn't respond in time enough, I probably have, I can put in some algorithmic fallback, which will look up quickly the top 10 things that are being sold on the site and just spit that out. So you can compensate for certain SLO failures with other kinds of things. I'll stop there for the moment.
Oh, thanks. No, that was really comprehensive. I want to spend a conscious, maybe of 10, 15 minutes left. So I want to spend a bit of time getting into kind of the real practicalities, right? How you know, I'm in an organization, I've read a lot about SRE, and you know, I feel like this is something you know, I want to get started with. And so Luca, maybe I'll come to you for this one. You know, besides obviously calling, you know, Luca Lanziani and at NearForm and asking for his help, you know, what are the practical ways though you can get started in the SRE space?
Okay, so going back to my question before, right? To my answer before, sorry. If you haven't started, is very weird. Meaning, if you haven't started taking care of your production system, there is a big problem in your organization, right? You're already doing it. Someone is already looking at those, right? It's going to be very weird for someone to put something in production and ignore them completely, right? So someone is already doing this. So what I would say is that you want to start working on perfectioning these processes. You want to start working on improving the processes. You want to start working on looking at what really matters. And Neil actually, I mean, pointed out good points there, right? For instance, if the user cannot log in, how do you monitor those? How do you improve their flow, right? I would go even further and say if a user cannot pay, because you care about that, right? Most of the time you care about that. But that's what you want to do. You want to start looking at who is doing that. You want to start actually taking a look at what they are doing, how they're doing that, why they're doing that, right? And then you're going to start supporting them, because those people know already what they're doing. If they're doing it, they know already what they're doing it. And obviously there are resources out there that people can use it, and probably we're going to mention some later on, right? And with those resources, you want to start improving the processes. You want to start improving all the non-functional requirements that you mentioned before, Colin. So taking care of availability, latency, performances. Now, that's from the technical standpoint, and that's all fine, right? You have technical people, you have developers that already care about those things, and so those people can already go there, improve what they're doing if they get the time to do so. But then there is something from the organizational standpoint, right? You have to recognize that you have this problem. You have to recognize that this problem needs attention. And so even the organization needs a little bit of restructuring to include this function into your organization. And one thing that I love about this function is not just the part where you take care about production environments, but it's the feedback loop that you can generate with this function to improve the previous step, so the development step. Because everything that comes out of SRE, everything that comes out from monitoring, alerting, logging, emergency response with postmortems can actually feedback into the whole organizational process and improve the overall release process of the software, the planning. So one thing that, for instance, SRE are responsible for is capacity planning, for instance, right? They need to know when you need more capacity, when your system needs to scale. That is perfect because they can feedback loop into even financing when they have to buy more compute power, when you have to buy more infrastructure, and how do you reserve instances. So I think the first part, the technical part, is fairly easy, meaning that you have someone that is taking care of those systems in production. They can keep going as long as you give them space and time. The second part, where you actually close the loop and you start creating this feedback, is a little bit harder because it's not immediately recognizable, it's not immediately achievable, right? That's the part where I will focus the most once the first part is solved.
That makes sense. And you mentioned a term, a postmortem. Niall, I mean, this has been in SRE practice, I think, for quite a while. Can you just tell me a bit more about the thinking behind postmortem, how it works, how you use those things in order to kind of progress and mature an organization or team?
Sure. So in common with a number of the other things you've mentioned so far in this seminar, companies have been set up about this, and there's no way we could do this topic justice in the time available. But I'll say the following. The super short summary is air accident investigation, except for computers. Okay, so why do people do air accident investigation? Because they want to try and help the accident not happen again. And if there's some weakness in how the system, socio-technical system, the actions of humans and the actions of computers work together to produce an outage, if there's some weakness there, we want to remove the weakness and prevent the thing from happening again. I suppose on a theoretical basis, one of the things I sometimes say is, if an SRE team did nothing other than air accident investigate and produce postmortems for issues, and, important caveat, the system did not change in any meaningful way, then the repeated application of this process would move the system asymptotically more towards perfectly reliable. Of course, no system is stable, or if there is a stable system, I suppose I've never been in charge of one. And with that caveat, I suppose I would say that the post-mortem activity and the post-incident report activity is hugely important. The one difficulty that you often encounter in conventional organizations is, as you say, getting that work prioritized.
Yeah, and that post-mortem, I mean, again, that feels like a real shift in mindset, because I suppose you're, in some way, you embrace failure, you become open, transparent that something has gone wrong. You shift to more of a blameless mechanism of trying to tease out what went wrong and how you improve, right?
Yes, so I mentioned in my previous paragraph about socio-technical systems. A lot of what we've been talking about already, possibly all of it, has been talking about socio-technical systems, but the way in which the socio and the technical interact is particularly clear in the case of postmortems, because with an array of what I'll call standard or blameful behavior that you often see in organizations, it's just very, very hard for an air accident investigation to produce much of worth. So it does require an organization to change, or at least to be able to facilitate this kind of work without too much friction. I suppose is the word I'll use. But the other piece I'd say is that there can be a huge conflict between the folks on the ground, boots on the ground doing the stuff, who very much in the wrong kind of company can feel they will be personally held accountable for this kind of stuff, even if it's not true, which is obviously a terrible outcome. And in some sense, you'd almost be better off not doing postmortems there. And sometimes post-incident discussions can end up taking on a flavor of kind of Marxist class theory, where you're going, okay, the folks on the ground doing the stuff versus the management versus the executives, which can often be extremely oppositional and just make it very hard to kind of make progress. Flipping that around though, executives are accustomed to managing systems on the basis of very high level metrics, like, are we roughly getting, you know, the number I care about is maybe the dollar number, or maybe I care about the click down in detail from that, and I care about the number, which is the people logging in, the average orders, the time it takes to complete orders, like stuff like that. And they don't, generally speaking, have a lot of time to go all the way down to the detail and then all the way up, etc. So one of the challenges which is presented to this mental model for running systems and running organizations is that failures are essentially infinite in a sufficiently complicated system. And as a result, executives often model systems that they're looking at as things which are basically fine, and then there's an exceptional situation and it becomes not fine, and we work to restore it and so on. Oh, okay, so what you mean then is that somebody did something bad, it went to the exceptional bad case, and then we brought it back by being good. Well, actually, no, it's kind of bad all the time, only there are certain kinds of bad which are noticeable and certain kinds of bad which are not. And that conversation is very hard to make executives understand.
Yeah, and just going a bit deeper in terms of, say, you know, ultimately that feels like there's that friction of where you go down this road, and you know, people maybe don't quite understand what they sign up for. You know, what are the other areas that, and maybe we'll keep it in the context of large organizations, maybe not like those in Google who are technology born and bred, but maybe large organizations who aren't. What are the frictions that they run into, the challenges when they try and adopt SRE?
Sorry, is this for me? Yeah.
Yeah, for you now. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So adoption of SRE. I mean, there are a large number of frictions possible. I suppose coming back to the postmortem discussion, I was talking about how there are maybe certain kinds of organizational culture which are more fertile ground for this kind of way of being than others. In the rather wonderful Accelerate 2018 book by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Jean Kim, which I strongly recommend you all read if you haven't already, it's just brilliant, you will find that they talk about a very, very simple model of organizational culture called the Westrum, W-E-S-T-R-U-M model. And basically it is divides organizational cultures into three columns, like the rules oriented, the power oriented, and I'm not quite sure, but I'd call it innovation oriented or something like that. But basically shoot the messenger, or the messenger isn't allowed to say the right thing, or hey, everyone, let's just sit around in a circle and be excellent to each other. So it turns out that certain kinds of culture are more fertile ground for SRE style approaches. And if you are in a power-oriented culture or a hierarchically oriented culture or a shoot the messenger, highly negative kind of culture, then SRE approaches, which often rely on being able to go horizontally safely, that might not be the best ground. And so perhaps you might need to change the culture first before you do this. Of course, some organizations attempt to use their SRE pilot to change the culture. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's a function of all of the standard things we know about all change projects everywhere, which is, do you have the right support at the right level? Are you resourced correctly? Do you have the right people? So on and so forth. Nothing about an SRE project is any different to any of those other change projects you might have come across.
Yeah, maybe look at the same question to you, just in terms of the challenges maybe that you've seen with organizations who want to go in this direction, but they're struggling to get there.
I think one you mentioned already, right? Both of you, is the no blame culture, right? And that is one that we saw in the past when we keep seeing, right? It's very hard to explain that if you start pointing fingers, the immediate result is that people is going to stop changing the system. And that is something that you don't want, right? If you point the finger to me, next time I'm not going to deploy. Next time I'm not going to deploy on Friday afternoon. There's this joke that keeps going around in the industry where you don't deploy on Friday afternoon, right? And that is half a joke, right? Because we keep saying if the system breaks on Friday, it's going to be a nightmare. Someone is going to have to stay awake and so on. But in the other side, there is the faction that pushes for, yeah, but you shouldn't have that problem altogether, right? You should be able to fix the system right away, even if it's Friday afternoon, even if it's 5 p.m., whatever, right? So one thing that is very hard to break is this fact that the system goes down is not bad per se, right? Breaking the system is not what is bad. It's actually going back to the metric, how quickly you can recover from that. And the fact that we are still pushing the boundaries and we try to change the system more and more frequently, right? We went from, years ago, there were a couple of deploys a year, right? You would deploy the system every 6 months, right? And then we moved to 3 months, and then we moved to, 1 month, and then we moved to weekly. And then there are people right now in the industry that are actually yelling out there that they can deploy multiple times a day, right? Imagine living in a culture where every time you deploy, you have to fear the fact that someone is going to yell at you, right? Or you're going to feel repercussions because something has broken. How can you live like that? How can you actually push multiple times a day and be sure that you can be safe when something is going to break? Because let's say something is going to break. Something is already broken. You probably don't see it, right? But something is going to break. So that is one of the biggest pushback, right, that you have. And you have to actually make the message very loud and clear that if you want to improve, there are studies there, right? There are studies that prove that if you start using those practices and if you push code more often, if you increase your velocity, you're going to stay ahead of the curve. The risk there is that if you don't do it, all the other companies are going to move faster than you, are going to innovate faster than you, and you're going to be out of business. Now, I'm putting this on the extreme, obviously, right? But this is just to prove a point. The point is, yes, that is one of the main one. You need to be aware that people need the freedom of pushing the code whenever they want without having to fear repercussion, and you need to invest money to put processes, tools, and systems around your system. So if something breaks, you can recover fast, or you can actually mitigate the failure.
Great. Thanks for that, Luca. We're going to move to some questions now, and we probably have a mix of questions, comments, recommendations. So I'm trying to unpick, but I'll try to get to them all. So maybe picking up on some of the points there that you were making, both of you, in the last piece was about this blameless piece being very important, and this commenter talks about human ops as a thing, and that, if you have a culture where people don't feel comfortable saying they were part of something which created failure, then you can't improve that process. You can't really progress. And I think that was a very good point that I think you both have probably made in slightly different terms. There's a recommendation here in terms of this person says that they see SRE as an elite enabling team. It's quite a good term. And in terms of the capacity planning model that they're recommending, some of the AWS pillars there in terms of doing that. There's a question here about enforcement of SLAs between delivery teams and with the SRE itself. And maybe this is one for you, Luca. how can you enforce them? Can you enforce them? What's the consequences? Sounds like someone had maybe a very specific example in mind here.
So enforcing is a strong word right now. Enforcing, I don't know what we mean by enforcing per se, right? Technically enforcing, that is going to be hard. There is something that, again, I'm going to go back to the book, right? Because I read the book, the SRE book, and it's there, right? There are error budgets that you can use, right? There are actually ways to enforce, and not enforce, but bring the system into certain limits where you start pushing features, and when you hit the limit, you stop changing the system. And that is one way to enforce. Now, what that is going to cause is that obviously you're going to reach the level of that agreement, you're going to keep that agreement, but also you're going to create pain for your team because it's not going to be able to push more features. And that is a nice thing, right? Pain is nice sometimes. Pain is going to force you to improve your processes. Pain is going to force you to improve what you're doing. So next time you're not going to burn your error budget too quickly. The other thing that you can, and that is from the technical standpoint, it's not really technical maybe, but it's more using technical things, right? The other thing is that, again, there is culture everywhere. Everything we said, the culture of the company is important, right? So if managers signing into this model, right, if they agree on this model, they are going to be the one enforcing those SLA, right? In many ways, right? In many ways. It may be focusing more on fixing bugs if you're not there. It may be investing more in toolings. It may be on investing more on people supporting the infrastructure, supporting the system, right? So those are the two main things. There is a KPI metrics that you can use, and there you block the people. The other one is actually, making your managers buy into the culture, and then they're going to be the one finding ways to enforce that, right?
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Luca. Again, that cultural piece, again, coming out very strongly. A couple of questions here, Niall, maybe. The first one, you may have touched on this when you talked about the different models of how SRE can be implemented. But the question is, how long lived should an SRE team be?
Yeah, this is potentially very complicated question, like many of the others we've touched on. I suppose the major recommendation I would have is that many companies like to put together project teams that have a short lifespan. Will swarm on this particular issue, fix it, and then the laser pointer will move somewhere else and we'll swarm on that, and so on and so forth. I think the difficulty I have with that is like the short-term benefit of swarm it is maybe non-negligible. Like there's people with expertise nearby to an issue, so like maybe accidentally they happen to fix it or whatever. But actually my bias, and I suppose I use that word advisedly, is that teams that are next to long-lived things, whether it's particular pieces of infrastructure, user journeys, or concerns about those journeys, like end-to-end teams looking after latency metrics. The longer lived the team is, the more chance it has that the individual members within it will develop sufficient expertise to be able to improve the underlying situation. The shorter lived it is, the more you are betting that the expertise that the people bring with them is going to be directly relevant to the thing. And like that can be wrong or it can be right. So I prefer long-lived just in general, because I think it works better for the individuals, and it also works better for the team in the sense that the team can kind of accumulate reputation in the organization and so on. Having said that, should a team remain in existence kind of indefinitely, even if there's nothing particularly great or good or whatever for it to be working on? No. Like there has to be some balance between the urgency of the situations which require the expertise and the coherence, et cetera, of the team. So there is no one answer, but probably defaulting to longer lived and probably defaulting to responding to the top N issues within your organization or system is a useful way to think about where the effort should be structured. And even within all of that, you can also have a team that looks after a bunch of systems, and you swap out one system and you swap in another system. And so the character, what the team looks after, changes over time, but maybe it's still within the top 3 priorities of the organization as a whole. So there's a lot of ways to do this.
No, very clear answer. Thanks, Niall. Luca, I might ask you this one, and it's, I think there might be different assumptions here in terms of definition. So I'll read it out as it came in, and I'll let you interpret it maybe and explain those. So it's asking, is an SRE, in your view, different to a platform team? And if so, how? And from looking at the next question, I feel that the person's using the team topologies kind of platform team definition.
It's very interesting that this question came after the answer from Niall, right? I was actually, when Niall was explaining,
it was there previously. Yeah, it was well,
whatever, right? You asked that, yeah, sure. You asked this after that, right? Because while it was explained there, long-lived versus short-lived, right? I was actually thinking about platform engineers in my head as a sort of SRE that supports multiple teams, right? So the platform engineers can actually be the one supporting multiple teams and can serve as an SRE for multiple teams. And that was in my head. So it's very interesting that you asked that question right after this one, because to me, those two are very strictly correlated. And what we see right now is the spawn up of this platform engineering, where you actually have a common set of problems that you want to solve for the whole or part of the infrastructure, maybe, because solving 100% of the problems is never easy, right? You're not going to be able to catch all 100% of your cases. So it's going to solve the problem for part of the infrastructure. Hopefully, if you're lucky, close to 90%, maybe 95, something like that. But with that, you actually serve as a generic SRE team for everyone. Now, obviously, there's still some differences because, as Niall said, you can be a generalist or you can be a very specialized person, right? So there are certain solutions that require a little bit more knowledge on the field to solve certain type of problems. So the platform team is good. It's probably going to serve as an horizontal layer for everyone to work on, but then you're probably going to still need someone who's going to work on the verticals. So they are not very different, right? They solve similar problems, but you're still going to find differences between the two. And maybe SREs can actually be the platform team that serves the 95%, as I say, of your organization.
Thanks, Luca. That makes sense. Conscious we're just coming up to the top of the hour. Now, one last question for you. I know you're working on something exciting, top secret. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
I'm working on a startup in the SRE space, which I hope to secure funding for shortly. And I think that as presumptive CEO, I'm supposed to say, I'm hiring right now, but yes.
Oh, I like it. I like it. Well, Niall is hiring, of course. NearForm are hiring. Check out our website for all the open opportunities. And of course, we're always here to help our new and existing clients work through their SRE journey. Thank you, everyone, for attending. My sincere thanks to Niall and Luca for taking time out of their busy journey to talk SRE today. If you have follow-up questions, we're on events@nearform.com. The webinar is recorded, so we will share that out, and you will get a chance maybe to share that with other members of your team. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you to my guests, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.